Good evening. Thank you for joining KATE News at 8. I'm Justin Garrison. Good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight on KATE News. I'm Justin Garrison, and our top story tonight is Kubernetes. That's our only story tonight. So let's dive deep into what is it, how does it scale, what does the community do, what's a CNCF, and many more coming up tonight on the news. And our first story is Kubernetes. Before we dive deep into the world of Kubernetes, we should look at where it started and where it's come from. In 2014, on the Google Cloud Platform blog, Google announced Kubernetes to the world with this post. Seemingly mundane at the time, Google was promising an open source solution to run containers at scale. The initial promises of the project were not very grand. Kubernetes was fighting against existing contenders like Mesos for running containers at scale. But Kubernetes had something the others didn't. A weird name and a nautical theme. A year after its initial release, the 1.0 Kubernetes launch happened at OSCON 2015. Let's look at one of the founders, Craig McLecky, how he described the project and cloud native in the early days.
I'm a product guy at Google. Been working on Kubernetes since the very earliest days. And I'm really happy to be here talking to you today, not so much about Kubernetes, though Kubernetes is a part of the story, but really talking about our move as an industry away from a traditional physical machine-based infrastructure management paradigm into this new world of cloud-native computing.
Eric Brewer, a VP at Google, also someone who writes some white papers or something, also had this to say about Kubernetes.
Totally honored to be here. It's been a remarkable year for Kubernetes. Really kind of crazy and more than expected. And certainly the community is the most important reason for that.
Eric agrees that the community is key to Kubernetes' success. We'll get to that piece in a little bit, but first, let's look at what's happened to Kubernetes over the last 6 years and what it's been doing. The Kubernetes project is hosted on a website called github.com. Kubernetes is an organization on that website, along with many other projects. The main repository of code for Kubernetes is often referred to as K/K. The project itself has more than 80,000 of the cryptocurrency known as stars, and the conference, including the one last week, has had many attendees from around the world come to learn more about how they can get involved and use this Kubernetes thing. So how has the project grown over time? Ever since the first public Git commit on June 6, 2014 by Joe Beda, the Kubernetes community and project have grown so fast they've outpaced most other open source projects. It's been in the top 10 open source projects by contributors or commits for the past few years. Kubernetes isn't the only large open source project, but it's one of the fastest growing. So let's look a little more at how it's scaled. One of the ways to understand how it's been scaling is to measure what's scaling. Kubernetes project does that through the DevStats website. This is a dashboard that's publicly accessible and shows all sorts of stats such as stars, forks, contributions, and even companies that are contributing to the code. DevStats aggregates and displays lots of different metrics for things you may not even know existed. How many unique contributors? Which companies are contributing? How many lines of code? How many forks? How many pull requests? All those sorts of things are available free in this dashboard. It has helped the community understand what's been happening and just keep a pulse on the whole Kubernetes ecosystem. As the project and community have scaled, they've had to split various parts of the project into their own repos, orgs, and then further breakdowns of who owns the code with owners and reviewers. If you want to get involved, the best thing to do is to start showing up. Come to some of the community calls, some of the SIG calls, and then understand what's being done. You may not know how to code, but you can still contribute in other ways. Those are all tracked here on DevStats. After you've contributed for a little while, you'll likely be invited to be part of the Kubernetes org. As the community has grown, they've put in different levels for community membership. After you've contributed for a little while and understand how the project works, you're likely to be invited to be a org member. Kubernetes org member gives you a little GitHub badge, and that's super fun. Beyond that, you'll probably start to do reviews. This might be code, this might be docs. Other areas that go through a GitHub pull request flow need reviewers. You might be invited to be one. After you've done some reviews for a while, you'll probably get to be an approver. Approvers are the ones that actually get to mash the button that says, I approve this thing, and it gets merged in. Do that for a little while, and you're likely to become a sub-project owner. You'll actually be an owner of some of the code and be responsible for updates and maintenance of that code. It's a very high honor within the community and is often rewarded at KubeCon events. There is a Chop Wood and Carry Water award that's given out at the events for community members who have done thankless work to do things like lots of reviews, pull requests, and generally just help the project maintain. Honoring these people inside the community is a great way to show that this is valued work and important work. With so many people joining the community from all different backgrounds and different places in their careers and life, how can you make sure that the community is still healthy? The project has 6 values which guide the community and the project itself. 5 of those are documented on the websites. The 6th one you'll only hear here on this special report. Those values are: distribution is better than centralization. This means there's people around the world, in lots of different time zones. Having one centralized place to focus all of the efforts doesn't scale well. So being able to distribute all of the work over the world and over time is very valuable. The second is community over project or company. This means that if a decision is being made inside of the repo, in the code, the community should be put first, rather than any independent company's needs or desires. The third is automation over process. People don't scale. Having bots and other things in place to automate the code, reviews, merging, and publishing helps everyone sleep at night. The fourth value is inclusive is better than exclusive. Everyone is welcome in the community, no matter your background, scale, or skills. The community welcomes contributions from designers, writers, or even people writing and creating content online. Sure, there's lots of code repositories and places that developers can get involved too, but that's not the only place that the community is looking for contributions. The fifth value is evolution is better than stagnation. This means that things change over time. Just because the decision was made about one way of doing something doesn't mean it has to stay that way. And the sixth and final value of the Kubernetes project is YAML all the things. So what good is values without a code of conduct to enforce them? The CNCF and all of the projects within its organization have codes of conduct that say exactly what you should or shouldn't do within that community. One of the most powerful things you can do for a community to help it grow is to have someone be able to point to rules and say, hey, we don't do that here. The code of conduct and how we enforce that allows us to keep the community welcoming for everyone, to make sure that everyone feels welcome. The question we often get in the community is K8s leaked? Is this an internal leak speak between other developers so you can know who's in? Let's take a look. K8s is actually a number nym. It's a shortening of a long word that has been going on for a very long time. Words like internationalization and accessibility are often shortened with numbers representing the letters in between the first and last letter. Kubernetes has also adopted this in a lot of communications to shorten typing out Kubernetes. Fundamentally, developers are lazy, and this helps. So if you didn't know before, you know now. Now let's look a little more broadly beyond just Kubernetes and see how it is that Kubernetes has been able to scale. One of the key factors of Kubernetes' success has been the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. The CNCF is a nonprofit organization that houses Kubernetes and many other open source projects. The reason it's valuable is it's a neutral body that can own these projects with copyrights and also provide support such as marketing and other materials so the projects can thrive. The CNCF adds a lot of value for things like standardization and making sure that anyone that's using Kubernetes and using the Kubernetes name is using it correctly. This helps a lot when maybe a company doesn't want to adhere to actual Kubernetes guidelines, but wants to still call something Kubernetes. The copyright lives within the CNCF, and they can actually take legal action against companies that try to use a name improperly. This allows any users to make sure they're getting the real thing at some level of compliance whenever they're actually using Kubernetes. This also helps with the job market. If you're a developer or a systems engineer trying to get a job in Kubernetes, you can get one of the Kubernetes certifications to help you on your path. And anyone looking for a certified Kubernetes administrator or application developer or security engineer knows that you are able to pass one of these tests that meet a certain bar within the ecosystem and not just something fake on your resume that can't be tracked or validated. One of the other ways the CNCF provides more community outreach is through the ambassador program. CNCF ambassadors are people that have applied to be part of a program that can show they know what they're talking about to help other people learn and grow. They might be producing content, working on projects, or generally just trying to allow people to adopt cloud-native technologies and processes. Of course, the CNCF also has members that are part of the cloud-native ecosystem. These are other companies that pay money into the CNCF to fund all of these projects. The CNCF has full-time employees such as documentation writers, marketers, and event planners. All of these roles take time and money to make sure that they go smoothly, especially at the scale of Kubernetes and cloud-native ecosystem. While the CNCF provides centralized services for many projects, Kubernetes has its own steering committee and different groups that are separated out to focus on areas of the project and community. The first is the steering committee itself. The steering committee helps guide overall progress within the project and the community. The Kubernetes Steering Committee is made up of 7 individuals who are elected by the community from the community. Each member serves on the committee for 2 years, and then a new vote will happen to elect new members. This steering committee is responsible for all non-technical decisions within the community, things such as the values, the bylaws, and even financial planning for the project itself. The committee has a public mailing list so that voting can happen asynchronously and meets twice a week to make sure that they're still on the same page with important topics within the community and the projects itself. This committee is also responsible for all of the GitHub orgs. There's lots of them. These GitHub orgs help you organize the different parts of the Kubernetes community. The main repository and organization has core code, but there's also sections such as the incubating, archive, and CLI orgs that have different components that are core to Kubernetes. There's also the Kubernetes SIGs org, which houses all the information and projects that are owned by the Kubernetes SIGs themselves. Special interest groups, also known as SIGs, is the core owner of all the code within Kubernetes. Each section of Kubernetes is broken up into different interests, such as multi-cluster or node scalability. In these interest groups is where the code lives and the technical decisions are actually made. These SIGs are responsible for triage on bugs for the code that they own, as well as long-term decisions such as adding enhancements or including new updates to the core libraries that they own. Each SIG has their own backlog of items as well as meeting schedule. This helps them organize into smaller groups at different times. Because technical decisions live within the SIG, they also meet typically on a bi-weekly basis. Each SIG has one or multiple SIG leads who are the core maintainer of each segment of code. There can be other members and contributors for the SIGs, but typically a few core maintainers are responsible for any major changes and planning to the architecture of their area of work. SIGs have regularly scheduled meetings to go over backlog items and new enhancements. This is a great way to get started if you want to just understand a certain area of work, because each SIG will have a document that is shared to discuss all of the backlog items and future work being planned. Bring up your questions here and get involved. It doesn't matter if you work at a big company or are an individual contributor. Anyone with insights on that area of work is welcome within the community to add feedback and discuss items on the roadmap. SIGs aren't just for code either. There's a documentation SIG as well as a contributor experience SIG. These are still areas that own bodies of work within the community that are responsible for their maintenance and growth and have leaders elected to be able to be points of contact for the release cycle and issues within the community. We now go to Justin in the field, who has an eyewitness about the Kubernetes community. Justin, are you there? Justin, out in the field. We want to go to you to see what the eyewitness has to say about the Justin, you're on mute, Justin. Thank you.
Oh, hi. Yes, this is Justin. I'm here in this field because I'm a field reporter. It's what we do. Some of us don't have nice, cushy desk jobs. We're out here. So, yeah, what does this have to do with Kubernetes? Nothing. Not a single thing. But here I am. So thanks, Justin. I do have an eyewitness though. He saw, like, he was there early on in Kubernetes project. He saw the project grow, and he was part of the community for a very long time. So want to ask him, tell me, sir, what was it like early on in Kubernetes? You were there before lots of other people. You saw it, grow up from almost nothing. In your own words, can you describe what the project and community is like? Oh, Justin, thanks. Is this like live? Like, hi, Mom. Yeah, this is really cool. What time is this gonna be? Oh, yeah, the project was, the community's really, well, I guess dope. Yeah, it's dope. So there you have it. That's it. I agree. That's great. So back to you in the studio, Justin. Have you, the AC, how is it? Like 71, 72? Like, that sounds nice. All right, back to you. All right, I'm out.
Okay, Justin, thank you for that in-depth report. And yes, the AC is great over here. Wow, yeah, the eyewitness had a lot to say. That's wonderful. Yeah, okay. Next up, let's go to sports. Justin, over to you. Oh, Justin, thank you for having me here tonight. We're talking strategy, and we need to figure out just what projects we can depend on. As you'll see, the CNCF has lots of projects, so let's take a look. You see, this is a big game we're playing in the cloud today. But we don't actually have a championship or anything. One of the CNCF steering committee's mottos is no kingmakers. So how do you decide what to pick from this board? There's way too many options here. Well, let's break it down real quick and figure out how to win in the cloud. First up in the CNCF, we got some sandbox projects. Those sandbox projects are kind of like your college sports. That's where you start and you can gain a lot of traction. You can have some big wins there and there's lots of talent. But it may not be the most widely watched, viewed, adopted. Those projects are just getting started sometimes within the CNCF ecosystem. Next up, we got incubating. These are like your minor leagues. This is where there's a ton of great talent, there's some adoption, there's some fans, lots of things are happening in the minor league section with incubating for sandbox project or for incubating projects. But you may not know exactly what to use. This roadmap still isn't very clear. Just beyond the incubating is graduating. Graduated projects, that's the big leagues. That's your Kubernetes, your Containerd, your Envoy, all the projects that are super mature, have broad adoption, and can be relied on to build anything you want in the cloud. But we need to look just how to strategize with all of this mess here going on. This is just too much going on, so we need to break it down, figure out some real strategy of what you need and what you don't. You can look at these projects as guidelines and just giving yourself a good offense and defense to really make sure your strategy for the cloud is golden. But this CNCF landscape right here does not give you the ideal path for what you're supposed to be doing in your strategy. That is up to you and your business. Can you believe that? But it can help you break down what components you need and which ones maybe you don't need, and then give you some options on which projects are within the ecosystem that you can rely on. So let's take a closer look at the landscape and figure out what strategy is a winning strategy for your business.
Now, let's take a good look at this landscape real quick just to see what's going on. The most important pieces you'll notice are over here in the scheduling and orchestration. Any container-based cloud-native infrastructure is going to need an orchestrator. Obviously, our golden boy here, Kubernetes, is there to lead the pack, but there's plenty of other options if you're looking for them. And what does Kubernetes do? It feeds the containers right over here to these other platforms. These platforms are hosted versions of Kubernetes. They allow you to run Kubernetes at scale, whether that's on-prem or in the cloud. But how do we get a platform in place? Well, this section right over here, provisioning. Provisioning is going to take automation and boom, give you a platform you can deploy to. But what's next? After I have provisioning, I have a cluster running, I need something else in there, right? Of course, you're going to need a registry. The registry's right here, and what it's going to do, it's going to feed all the containers, boom, right here, to your container runtime. Container runtime can't exist alone. It needs to depend on cloud-native networking and cloud-native storage right here. They both add some more blocks there so you can be successful with your container infrastructure. Now, a good offense is worth nothing if you don't have a good defense. What do we get for defense? You really got to look at security and compliance, all right in here, some key management, and of course, observability and analytics. This can give you all your logs and metrics for all your platform. So you can make sure that as the metrics and logs are coming in, you can understand what's going on and really make sure you can score that touchdown, whatever you're trying to do. The last piece in here that we'll talk about is kind of a special teams, what I like to call it. It's this whole networking stack all right in here. Things like service meshes, ingress, service proxies. These are all things that are really important to be able to pass the container around to other services. Things like north-south traffic, east-west traffic, just how you're getting access to your services and how they're communicating with each other. These are all critically important, but not always the first thing you consider when you think about Kubernetes. And finally, the last piece we want to talk about down here is all your training and all your special needs. Any support services and things that you're going to be looking for, all down here collected at the bottom. And this is all a great place to look if you want to really level up on your Kubernetes journey.
Thanks for that, Justin. It's easy to see now how you can use all of these projects in that landscape to set a clear path to victory. Now, let's look at what it takes to get involved within the project. As we mentioned before, there's a special interest group dedicated just to contributor onboarding. SIG Contrib X is focused on contributor experience within the community. This SIG helps onboard new people into the community and the project itself. As we also mentioned before, one of the values of Kubernetes is automation over process. This means if you're submitting your first pull request to documentation or code, you might be met with some bots. Bots are used as part of the automation process within Kubernetes to help it scale and the maintainers sleep at night. Bots are used for all sorts of things, such as reviewing code, checking code coverage, looking for contributor license agreements being signed, and even throwing in a few jokes. Bots are a core for the GitHub automation to make sure that all of the code is set to a certain standard and allows reviews of the pull requests to be accelerated. Sometimes new contributors have big new ideas. Within the Kubernetes community, these are known as Kubernetes Enhancement Proposals, also known as KEPs. KEPs are a way to document and progress new features within the project to make it safe for adoption, but also make sure it integrates well within the project. To learn more about KEPs, we're going to go to Justin in Weather to find out. Over to you, Justin. Hey, thanks, Justin. So now, before we go into the weather too deeply, let's look at the Kubernetes roadmap. I'm just kidding. There isn't one. And that's the whole point of a KEP. See, the KEP is a process that we use to add enhancements or features into Kubernetes. So let's look at how that's made up. And first thing we need in a KEP is the metadata. And metadata defines the scope of the world of the things that we're impacting. All of these KEPs are still owned by a SIG, because that's where the code's going to live. But in order to go through the process, it needs to be approved and implementable inside that SIG scope. So we look at this metadata first of just what it looks like, what kind of features we want to add. The next stage is actually to go through the workflow of the KEP. We're going to deal with a high pressure system from the project itself. That's just kind of standard for anything that has big visibility, and maybe a low pressure system down here of people that actually want to implement this feature. And so we look at both those forces as they combine. Right here in the middle, that's where we get our KEP process. Now the KEP is going to go through all of these stages just to make sure that it's something that the Kubernetes project wants to own long term, that it's feasible and a good feature that a lot of users can benefit from it, but also that we can learn through the process and we can understand just how these things have grown over time and look back over time to say, hey, this is where this KEP came from, this is why it was there, and the KEP fills in all of that data inside of the template so that we can make sure it's valuable to everyone. So let's look at the forecast of what a KEP's going to go through if you submit one and try to add a new feature. You can see here the good forecast outcomes are the KEP is actually implementable, which means someone can build it and work on it. And then it's implemented. That's the best situation. This is a process where the KEP is pulled in, the code is created, and the code is merged into Kubernetes. Not every KEP is designated to be pulled into Kubernetes as a major feature or as intended. So let's look at the forecast for maybe the not so sunny side of what a KEP might end up being. Here you can see that a KEP could be deferred. Deferred just means that the KEP was proposed, maybe even approved, but not actively worked on because there's no owners to actually implement the code. The KEP could have been rejected because some design decisions or something else took the place of that KEP that just means it's not needed anymore or it wasn't a good design. The KEP could also be withdrawn. Withdrawn means that the author has actually wants to remove the KEP from consideration as part of the Kubernetes project. Maybe this is something that is going to be implemented in an ecosystem controller or somewhere else in the ecosystem. And finally, a KEP could be replaced. It could be replaced by another KEP that implements the same features, or some other feature that was rolled in with the project. So with this KEP process in place, we're able to take ownership of the entire world here of what we're improving with Kubernetes, but also make sure that it's highly visible and there's owners throughout the entire process. The final stage of a KEP, let's say it was implemented, is actually to look at the artifacts and outcomes of the KEP itself. These are things like documentation, training, new things that need to be put in place, but also surveys to make sure the KEP process is working for everyone and is used by enough people to be valuable. And the last part of the KEP is actually knowing the success of the feature that was requested. These are things to allow the KEP to know long term, what does it mean to actually go from an alpha feature to a beta feature to a graduated and a stable feature. These are areas that the KEP itself needs to define for the feature to make sure that everyone can take advantage of it. And right here we can see those stages, and that's just a great way to know long term, hey, what does this look like? So when a feature is up to graduate into beta, we can look back at the KEP and say, oh, that is actually what we want to do. Here's the success metrics, and we met those success metrics. And so that gives you a great overview here of what a KEP is and just how you can get involved if you want to add features into Kubernetes. Back to you, Justin. Thank you, Justin, for that in-depth look at the KEP process. With so much going on inside of Kubernetes, you might be asking, how does it stay secure? Well, there's a security committee, of course. This security committee allows for disclosures and security vulnerabilities to be disclosed in private. There's only a certain number of people that are allowed on that board, so they can privately work within SIGs depending on where the security vulnerability is found. By having a private disclosure process, this allows work to be coordinated with other vendors and hosting providers to make sure that the security vulnerability can be patched with the least amount of necessary people knowing. This keeps Kubernetes secure for any users because hopefully it can be patched by the time it's actually announced. The Kubernetes release cycle is time-based and not feature-based. This means that 3 releases come out no matter if your feature gets in or not. This helps with the security as well because minor patches can be rolled out quickly without needing to wait for a large feature to be merged in or tested. We take a break from Kubernetes for just a second for some breaking news. The cubicle sharing service Kuber had another engineer disappear. The service allows you to list your unused cubicles to share them with the community no matter where they are. Unfortunately, this is the 3rd engineer that's disappeared in the last 2 weeks. Management's unclear if they just decided not to come into work or actually were gone. Eyewitnesses report that the engineers disappeared in a flash of light. It's uncertain yet if this is at all Kubernetes related, although some people that have disappeared were on the Kubernetes team. Justin will have more on this story next week at All Day DevOps, as this story is still developing. Please join us next week as we look into what they may have been working on. Kubernetes is a big project with lots of moving pieces. Not only do APIs change, KEPs get merged in, but also there's a whole ecosystem of tooling that relies on releases of Kubernetes to make sure it's stable. People are running production on this code and need it to be reliable. So how does an open source project become such a large piece of anyone's infrastructure? And how does it make releases? Well, through volunteers, of course. Kubernetes has a new release 3 times a year. This is a change from the previous 4 times a year, which was very fast, to say the least. At 3 times a year, the project is hoping to slow down some of the speed at which it goes so they can make sure that things are stable and the project thrives. A release isn't just binaries that happen to end up on GitHub. It's also a whole ecosystem of tooling that is relying on those binaries and API compatibility to make sure nothing breaks. The release process is made up of, just like the SIGs, lots of different teams that own the code through each release. Each SIG is responsible for their own code, but there's some overarching teams that are responsible to organize all of the SIGs together to make a release. Each release has a release team lead who is kind of like the cat herder of cat herders, who manages to make sure that all the other groups are able to ship the code on the given date. Each smaller team is led up of a lead, which is responsible for focusing on their specific area. Maybe it's documentation or communication or enhancements. And those leads have more shadows. The shadows are new people to the process. Maybe they've done it once or twice before, but typically they're new and they're learning how the process works. A lot of the process is documented through, of course, GitHub READMEs, and new people that want to get involved can apply through a Google form for each release. Each application is looked at depending on what the person has contributed in the past and what they want to do with the project going forward. Because there's such a demand for this, only a certain amount of people are able to get into the process for each release. As the release gets closer to the actual date of release, they have frequent calls to make sure that everything is lined up and there's nothing blocking the release. Enhancements need to be pulled in or pushed further down to future releases. That needs to be coordinated with the people writing the code, the SIGs that own the code, and all the other release team SIGs in between for things like communication and marketing. There's also a post-release webinar to help anyone that maybe wasn't close to the release understand what's new in this version of Kubernetes and how it's changed. Maybe there's a breaking feature or a new feature that's graduated. The webinar is a great place to get involved to understand just what's in the release. The final release is tagged and pushed to GitHub, and automated builds will actually push the binaries to GitHub after that. There is a launch blog that'll be on the Kubernetes blog with details about some of the major trends and features and themes. The release lead is responsible for picking a overarching theme for that release, as well as a really cool, fun project icon. After each release, there's a retrospective and some surveys to make sure that the project learns what worked and what didn't. Nothing in this process is set in stone, and anyone is free to come and change something if they think it works better. As we stated earlier, there's a new release 3 times a year, and those releases are supported for about a year and a half. So users of the software are expected to upgrade on at least an 18-month cycle. Having great documentation and change logs for each release help give some confidence for not only the users, but the ecosystem to know that they can build on which versions of Kubernetes and which features they should be using. If you're new to Kubernetes, shadowing on one of the release teams is a great way to get involved and understand all the moving parts. Before we close tonight, I'd just like to say the Kubernetes community is a great way to get involved with open source. One of my first contributions to Kubernetes was in documentation, and I highly encourage anyone who's looking to get involved to add their own PRs. Documentation is a great place to get started. You're reading the docs anyway. If you see something that's confusing to you or doesn't make sense, open a PR. You'll meet some new people, and you'll understand the process a little bit more. Thank you for joining us tonight on KATE News. I'm Justin Garrison, and I hope you have a wonderful week. Good night.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in for that session. Now we can go into our Q&A session with Justin.
This microphone is not real. It's not plugged in. Hi, I'm here for K.
I have outtakes at the end. It's all right.
All right. There you can pose your questions to Justin in the chat, or you can go ahead and use the Q&A feature. There was a question earlier, Justin, if this video will be posted on YouTube.
I didn't know if ATO posts them. If not, I mean, I can put it up on YouTube too. I was going to ask as well if those are split up and put on the ATO account.
So I know the sessions are recorded in terms of how they're going to get that video out to attendees, then they'll have that communication sent out to them.
Yeah. So we'll find out as soon as ATO's over.
Yeah. So again, you can put your questions in the Q&A, or you can go ahead and put them in the chat.
Yeah, I thanks everyone for coming. I wish, I was just hoping that there was some like cohesive thing that showed all these things. There's been lots of talks like this in the past that focus on individual areas. And so there's lots of, if you want to look at KEPs for, the entire process, I was trying to give a general overview for anyone that was new to the project, new to open source, what to expect with Kubernetes and, coming into such a large, fast moving project.
Not seeing any questions as far. If anyone wants to get in contact with you, Justin, do you have your contact information? Possibly drop in the chat to them.
Yeah, Twitter is the easiest way. I've opened DMs. That's usually the one of the most ways I'm responsive. Email's another option, but this is probably the easiest. Just I don't have email on my phone, and I don't keep Slack on my phone, so I will reply to DMs, and we can figure out if we want to go to email or something else.
All right, wonderful. There's a question in the chat right there.
Favorite KubeCon session? I didn't get a chance to watch all of the ones I want to, so I've only watched a handful of them so far. But so far, Noah Abrahams, the Safari Kubernetes talk was quite hilarious, and I loved it. It told a real story, like a nature show. And so if you haven't seen that one, that was a good KubeCon talk from last week. But obviously, like if you see my talks, I like the more silly, entertaining talks. I love information too, but I try to entertain, and that's what I like to watch as well. So.